Wow, good day, Keystone, and always good to be able to share God's word with you. Last week, we looked at a phrase which we introduced called humble confidence. Today, what we're going to look at is how we live that out practically in our lives. Paul introduces us to the phrase in Ephesians 2:8-10, and calls us to live in humility and dependence on the grace of God, to understand that our salvation is by grace and grace alone, and even the faith that we have to work out this salvation is a gift from God. But then he calls us in confidence to these amazing works that he calls us into. And we want to be able to live out our lives in humility, but also with great confidence. And we need to ask ourselves the question is, can these two amazing, excellent traits exist in one person at the same time? I believe it is possible because it's demonstrated to us by Jesus. If you look at Jesus' life, you see in him a man in human form who's incredibly confident yet extremely humble. He's majestic, but he's meek. He's supremely powerful, but he's submissive at the same time. So these two excellent traits can exist in the same person at the same time. You see, what we try and tend to do is we try and do one or the other, but never both at the same time, which really makes us truly effective and powerful. So if we want to be humble, what we'll try and do is maybe shrink back and not be too outstanding, try not to be too big. But you see, humility is not so much about shrinking back or not standing out, but it's understanding and coming to terms with where the grace or the power or the reason is for our faith, where it comes from. Like Paul would remind us in 1 Corinthians 15. He writes this: Paul, an incredibly confident man who achieved many things in his life, but yet remained incredibly humble. And he gives us a key as to why. 1 Corinthians 15 reads like this: For I am the least of the apostles and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. You see, Paul is amazing in the sense where he did some amazing things in his life, and he worked hard, but he realized that God's grace to him was what he needed to depend on. But God's grace wasn't in vain either. So that produced confidence in him, knowing that the grace that God had given him and was working out through him was going to have a powerful effect in the world. So he knows God's grace is not in vain, that it is effectual as it comes into his life and through his life into others. God calls us into the same manner of living, and what we want to do today is look at a few ways in which we can spread these wings, one of humility and one of confidence, that our wingspan could increase as we begin to put into practice some ways in which we can actually do that. So firstly, we need to remain open and teachable for people's feedback into our lives. And the way that God inputs our lives is sometimes we don't want any feedback. We feel we've got it all together, but often we're just pretending. We also need to understand that we have strengths, but we certainly do have weaknesses or areas that we can grow in, undoubtedly, if we're honest with ourselves. But how do we grow in those weaknesses? And where do we get to exercise our strength? Well, God puts us in a community, doesn't he? Sometimes we don't get the direct download from God, but what we get is God adds us into the life of the church. That's where the church becomes so vital, is because he surrounds you with people so that they may input into your lives where you're weak, but you can input into their lives where you're strong. And so it works like an ecosystem where we all work together like this body, growing in powerful strength. But in order to do that, we mustn't live isolated lives. We must be open to feedback and input into our lives. So do you have that person where you talk about things more than just trivial matters of sport and COVID and how's work going? But what about the deeper things in life, your relationships, the things that you enjoy, where you're at spiritually? Is anyone in your life that can feed you in that way? And have you opened the door to be vulnerable, to allow them to speak into your life? Secondly, we need to stay grounded. That word grounded actually is where we get our word humility from. It comes from the Latin word called humilis, which means to be grounded. And so to be grounded in a Christian sense, or in our sense, is really about reorientating our lives. A question I would love to ask you is, does God fit into your world, or do you fit into God's world? It can be revolutionary when you make that shift of thinking, when you're no longer asking God to fit into your world, but you serve him in his great and glorious world. It's counterintuitive, because we would think, gee, if everything revolved around me, well, then I would be large and life would be amazing. But in actual fact, when you allow everything to terminate on you and you want everything to revolve around you, well, in actual fact, your soul shrinks. But when you come to terms with the fact that you fit into God's world and you want to serve his purposes, and you give your life to something that's bigger than you, and you don't allow it to terminate on your wants and desires, and you give your life to something that's bigger than you, well, then your soul just grows large. You see, that requires faith to do that. And so to be grounded really means that we need to reorientate our lives often, because our tendency is to want to build everything around us. And Jesus says, no, lay down your life in order to find life, that your soul may grow large. Are you giving yourself to something that's bigger than you? And I would implore you today to give your life to Jesus and his plans and purposes for your life. Then truly your soul will grow large and you will find amazing life. Thirdly, we need to practice gratitude. Practice, nobody likes the word practice, but practice can be hard work at times, but we need to put things into practice in order for them to be realized. Practice gratitude. When we ponder on the things that we are thankful for in our lives, and we begin to think about all the things that God has put in our lives, the privileges that he's given us, what we actually can cultivate in our lives is a sense of worth. What it does foster is a sense of worth in our lives. And secondly, when we do practice thanksgiving, we give off an air of optimism to others. We give off this fragrant aroma that is just amazing, and we begin to influence people. You see, because gratitude, as we practice gratitude, as we nurture gratitude, as we ponder on the things that we're thankful for, what it's going to well up in you is a spirit of generosity, to be able to better the environment around you and the people that surround you. Whereas if you just go your natural way without putting gratitude in play, what you're going to begin to foster is a sense of entitlement, which is what the devil wants us to, is have this sense of entitlement that God owes us, or God's holding out on us, or you owe me, I deserve. That is a sense of entitlement. So in our hearts, they can become greedy like that, where we feel that others or God owe us, we deserve a better life. You see, when we practice gratitude, what it does do is it strips us of our sense of entitlement. Gratitude produces a generous spirit. Entitlement produces a self-centeredness in our lives. We need to practice gratitude. So won't you today or this week just take a journal, or even take a moment of a few minutes, half an hour, just to think about the things that you are grateful for in your life. And be sure to pick up the phone and thank those who have been an absolute blessing to you in your life. Fourthly, what we need to do is learn how to live and stand in other people's shoes, to have a heart of compassion, to ask God for the same compassion that Jesus had. He is the wonderful counselor who not only come to bring about an amazing salvation, but he identifies with us in every way. You see, many people aren't asking us to fix their problems, but what many people just desire is to be understood. They just need understanding. When they feel that they are understood, it releases power in them to be able to overcome their problems. What we want to do is fix their problems. You see, compassion meets people where they're at, but doesn't leave them where they're at. It gives them the power to be able to overcome the challenges, and often that's because They've been identified with or understood. You see, we need to just go one step further than feeling sympathetic for people, is we need to ask God to give us the eyes and the understanding to be able to understand people's points of view and their vantage point on life. You see, often we come in with our vantage point and say we can just fix that. But truly we need to see their vantage point, and for God to give us eyes to see that we may understand and learn how to stand in other people's shoes. So let's ask God today to give us wisdom, but also to give us understanding of one another, because that will truly produce unity in the church. But when people feel understood, what it does do for us is it creates this massive, weighty bridge upon which we can deliver amazing truths. If they don't feel understood or identified with, we sometimes can't get the truth that God wants to share into their lives because we haven't built the bridge of understanding. Fifthly, I would love us to be a people, or you to be a person, who would at times just take amazing leaps of faith. When somebody takes an amazing leap of faith, it has resounding effects on the people in and around them. Not only your life, but it has this ripple effect onto the people around them. There's a story in Matthew 14 of Peter, and I thank God for Peter. Peter sees Jesus on the water and he says, Jesus, if it's you, tell me to come to you. And Jesus, what a wild idea. It's like there's nobody else around. The disciple says, tell me to come to you on the water. Jesus says, come, and Peter walks on the water. This is incredible. But then he begins to get a bit anxious when he sees the waves and the boat's a bit back there and Jesus over there. He begins to sink and he's all wet and he flops it and Jesus has to pick him up out of the water. But you have to ask, how did they get back to the boat, which is amazing. I reckon they must have walked back to the boat. But you would think when they got back on the boat that Peter might have been teased and, Jack, Peter, you do first, you daft, you try to walk on water, but then you sank. The disciples don't do that. Do you know, Peter took an amazing risk, and even though he flopped it halfway through and he got all wet and his clothes are drenched, I want you to see the response of the people that looked at him. Matthew 14 says this, when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped. Wow. That is an amazing thing, when we're prepared to sometimes step out of the boat, knowing that we may fail and get all wet. The result is, those looking in worship. They worship. They worship Jesus. We need people who are prepared to get wet. Number 6, we need to live into our potential. When we read the Gospels, what do you see? When you read the book of Acts, what do you see? When you look at the disciples, the way in which they engaged life and people, how they transformed the world and turned cities upside down. God has given you a picture of your potential. But potential just remains potential unless you're prepared to walk into it. As Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, he did some amazing things, Paul. But the amazing thing with Paul is he says in 1 Corinthians 15, but by the grace of God. He knew where the power and the grace came from. And so we need to be leaning hard and fast and attaching and abiding in God day by day, that we can realize our potential. Lastly, be present. Be present with your family, be present with your spouse, be present with your children, be present in your church, be present with your neighbors. And what does it mean to be present? It means to be all there. And I'll give you 2 things on this. It means that we need to learn how to listen well. Stephen Covey said many people listen with the intent on replying, but very few people listen with the intent of understanding. When you listen to somebody, are you stuck in your own head, formulating your own answer and what your response is going to be? Or are you listening to understand? Because if you're listening to understand, people will feel that, and you will have the privilege of speaking amazing life into their lives. The second thing is we need to see people. Simon the Pharisee was sitting with Jesus as a woman from the city came and began to pour perfume on his feet. And he thought to himself, if Jesus knew who this woman was, he wouldn't be letting her do this. Jesus could see straight through into his heart. And he said to him, Simon, do you see her? Jesus came to open the eyes of the blind. He came to open our eyes, that he would give us spiritual eyes to be able to see and understand people around us, that we may see life from their perspective, identify with them like the wonderful counselor he did with us, but then be able to speak the truth in love to them. My friends, these are 7 ways in order to foster humility, but that humility produces a confidence in us that God is working in and through us to transform and change the lives of multitudes of people. We thank you. We hope you enjoyed today, and we look forward to next week.